Well, here we are. It's Hebrews chapter 11 today, this great chapter about faith. It's a famous chapter in the Bible. It's been called the Saints Hall of Fame. I've got a list here of the names. The Honor Roll of Saints, a list of the heroes of the faith. Important chapter, pivotal chapter really in Hebrews. Gives us example after example. And that's what Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, is doing here. He's giving, after really pleading with the Hebrews to go on, warning them, giving them every reason that they should continue in the faith. Now he's going to give them examples and how it shows us how powerful a good example is. It gives us a conviction when we see faith living in other people's lives. It gives us conviction and desire, I think, to live by that same faith. It gives us a motivation. If they could do it, we could do it, I think is the example here. And I think in the writer to the Hebrews here is giving the Hebrews and us a reason to go on in faith, which raises the question, what is faith? I think what this chapter tells us, it's the certainty, and I want to emphasize that word, certainty, of receiving what God has promised, but not yet given. Certainty of receiving what God has promised, but not yet given. I think that's the message of those first three verses in this chapter today. I labeled those first three verses the preliminaries. This is kind of introducing faith. And then in verses 4 through 16, we find that faith enables the faithful one to please God. Verses 17 through 31, the faithful person is enabled to take risks. And 32 through 35, the faithful person is able to overcome obstacles. I have to look down at my notes. So to please God, to take risks, and to overcome obstacles, and all built on this certainty of receiving what God has promised, but not yet given. So let's look at a couple examples here. Look at an example from each section. So in verse 4, we have Abel. What was Abel's act of obedience? His act of obedience enabled him to give sacrifices and offerings. Apparently, it's not told us explicitly, but apparently according to God's instructions. Abel didn't have the understanding of what this was all about. He had the instruction from God, apparently, to offer certain sacrifices, but he didn't have the sight. He didn't understand what this was all about. He was just doing it because God told him to do. And the result of that, he is known as a righteous man. Righteous people obey God. God accepted his offering. And even after his death, we are still looking at Abel here in chapter 11 as a example of faith. Even after his death, his example of faith lives on. So we see that Abel's faith enabled him to please God, like Abraham. Abraham's referring back to Genesis 12, 1 through 7. What did faith enable Abraham to do? Well, to be moved from his home in Ur to Canaan, enabled him to live there in tents, temporary resident in that land, enabled him to become even a father in his old age. Abraham was well advanced in years. He could not and did not foresee what the land would be like when he left Ur. He had no idea. He had never been there before. It says specifically that he went to a land he did not know. And he looked forward to a new Jerusalem, which he could not see. So again, faith is this confidence of receiving what God has promised before, but he has not yet given it. So he was promised this new city, this new land, but hadn't seen it. And he couldn't comprehend how he could have a son in old age. So Abraham didn't have sight in these areas. He didn't understand this, and instead he had to receive it by faith. So what was the result? Abraham received the land by an inheritance. His sons became heirs with him, and he became a resident of that heavenly Jerusalem and will be a resident of that Jerusalem that comes down from heaven in the book of Revelation. And many descendants came from Abraham. We know that. If we go on to the next section about taking risks, well, we have just a number of saints here. I'll just pick two of them. Joseph, for example, he was referring to the end of Genesis 50, verses 24 and 25, where Joseph is saying he wanted to be buried in the land. He couldn't see the land again. That is his absence of sight. The risk he's taking here is he had no way of seeing the Exodus about which he spoke. He didn't know about the Exodus. It's for us, it's in the past, so certainly it looks like it might have been easier for him to believe it. But the fact of the matter is he had no inkling of the Exodus. But he believed God and believed what God had revealed to him about it. And he believed that his dead body would be going back to the land of Canaan. He was confident that God would restore his people back to the land he had promised them, even though it wasn't happening at that time. How frustrating that must have been for Joseph. And God fulfilled what he had revealed to Joseph about the forthcoming Exodus. And Joseph was carried back to the land that God had promised them. Rahab. You have Joseph, one of the patriarchs, but here we have Rahab, a Gentile, not only a Gentile, but a woman, and she could not know ahead of time. You know the story of Rahab from Joshua, how she received the Hebrew spies into her brothel, hid them, helped them spy out the land, and then sent them away. She had no idea whether or not her people would kill her for helping the spies. That was the risk she was taking. That was the lack of sight that she had. But she had heard, if you read that chapter, she had heard about the God of Israel and how he was working in that nation and was going to restore them to the land. So she risked being killed by her own people. That is the risk she took. And the act of belief was in welcoming the spies. And in that welcome, revealed her faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And she was used by God to protect the Israelites. And we know that from Matthew's gospel that she's part of Jesus's genealogy. We know that she is revered even today, mentioned in the book of James as well as an example of faith. And this is a Gentile woman, so there's her reward. He goes on to talk about overcoming obstacles, and we have his judges, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. He mentions them, and the obstacle they had to overcome was their enemies all around them, enemy kingdoms, which they conquered. Daniel was another of the persons that had obstacles before them. Of course, Daniel was in exile in Babylon under the authority of the king there. The obstacle he had to face, he was thrown into a den of hungry lions. And by faith, or the result of his faith, was that those mouths of those lions were shut. So we see examples here throughout this chapter of people who had this certainty of receiving what God had promised, but not yet given. That is faith. And because of their faith, they were able to please God. They were able to take tremendous risks, and they were able to face and overcome obstacles. So I wonder what your obstacle is in your life today. What are you trusting God for that his word says he's going to give you, but he has not yet given? I encourage you, brothers and sisters, to look closely at this chapter today in your reading. Draw strength from these examples. Don't give up, whether you are trying to please God and have not yet received the blessing from him, Whether you're about to take a risk and you're wondering how this is going to work out, or even now you're in the midst of a trial and facing obstacles, I encourage you to trust God for what he said he will promise but has not yet given to you, or what he has promised you but has not yet given to you. Trust him, brothers and sisters. And like these men and women, I don't think you'll be disappointed, and I think that you'll be an example of those around you of the kind of faith that pleases God, the kind of faith that takes risks, and the kind of faith that faces and overcomes obstacles. Be an example today and be strengthened in yourself by reading this. God bless you. Have a great Tuesday, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. We'll be in Hebrews chapter 12.